technology editor. And we're here today to introduce Roger Hefferan, a former State Department official with the Reagan administration, and his role in the exchange of information regarding the transfer of technology to the People's Republic of China in 1982. Roger's concern is a matter of conscience in regards to the movement of high technology and how it impacts the world today. And certainly as we sit here under a nuclear cloud from the last nuclear accident, these issues are very relevant to the current war madness that we're experiencing. So I'd like to introduce Mr. Roger Hefferan.
Thank you all very much for coming. I'm going to go first into my background. I've been a lifelong Republican from a Republican family, served in the Nixon administration, the Ford administration, and as a Reagan appointee. I've always been on the, if you will, the inside of Republican political activities, hoping to have an impact on it. Today I've come forward, setting it aside, stepping away from it, because frankly, I have given up on having any positive impact on the Republican administration through elective politics. My background in early 70s, I was in the Nixon price controls. I worked as the assistant to the ambassador who was the head of international trade negotiations, the job that Robert Strauss made quite prominent. I went from there to be the assistant to William Scranton when he was our United Nations ambassador under Jerry Ford. I left the administration when Mr. Carter was elected president. Moved to Southern California. While there, I helped Richard Nixon write his book, The Real War, and was the first outside editor brought in. Made quite a number of substantial contributions to the book, particularly in the chapter on disarmament. After Mr. Reagan was elected, several years after Mr. Reagan was elected, I was asked to come to the State Department, and I took a senior position in the Economic and Business Bureau of the State Department. My primary responsibilities there were in the area of East-West trade, both in terms of grain negotiations with the Soviets and in terms of technology transfer to Eastern Bloc countries. For example, in March of '83, I was a senior State Department employee to go to Moscow for the grain talks. But today I want to talk in particular about the subject of technology transfer. What happened in 1982 and in 1983 with regard to some proposed and presidentially approved sales of computers and computer design technology to the PRC has been sitting on my conscience for the last 4 years. It's the reason when I left the Reagan administration and came out to California, I couldn't just join civilian life. I wanted to get back in Congress, which is why I ran in '84 unsuccessfully for the Republican nomination. Let me get into the details of the transfers that I'm speaking of. First, let me tell you the importance to China on nuclear delivery by missile. They are held up in two regards in having an ICBM which can reach anywhere around the world. First, in computer miniaturization. The Chinese PRC I am speaking of require a large missile because they have large computers. They are nearly, as of 1982, they were nearly 20 years behind our level of miniaturization. Therefore, they were required to have much larger motors, propulsion, much larger fuel tanks, and therefore have consequent short limits on their ability to reach with their missiles. For example, the northwestern corner of the Soviet Union, the area where was this recent explosion in the nuclear power plant, was an area that has been, last time I was involved in this classified information, out of reach of Chinese ICBMs. That's why the Russians use this area for their nuclear power plants, where incidentally they frequently co-located their nuclear weapons production facilities. Now this is only speculation from my part, but probably the reason the Soviets have been so slow to open the facility to Western assistance is any Western official walking through there would find the double use of this facility. Similar to what we used in Oak Ridge, the production of nuclear warheads requires an intense amount of electricity. Therefore, you co-locate it with the production of electricity. Well, anyway, the second limitation, the first limitation, as I said, is the miniaturization of their computers. If they were able to make smaller computers, they could have smaller missiles, and with their technology of missile design, they could deliver a missile anywhere. So the second factor would be improving their missile design so they could build a larger, more effective, long-range missile. Well, the two sales I'm going to describe would have handled each of those problems separately. The first sale I'm going to describe is a sale of a computer called the High-Share 700. This is a computer of which slightly more than 60 were built in 15 years. Of the 60 which were built in 15 years, a handful are in the hands of our NATO allies. The remainder are at places like White Sands, Boeing, Lockheed, and a few universities that have primary government contracts. Most of the U.S. facilities had a model known as the High-Share 600. White Sands, for example, had a High-Share 600. At the time of our successful blocking of the sale, George Shultz had already left aboard one of the Air Force One facsimile airplanes en route to China with a presidentially approved decision to give that computer to the Chinese. It was a relatively inexpensive computer, less than $10 million. Quite long to build it, and as I said, quite few have been made. We fought this sale throughout its levels of approval within the administration, at the what's called in the government the office director level, then the deputy assistant secretary level, then the assistant secretary level. Each time the facts that I distributed, which I had researched and dug out, successfully blocked it and had a decision denied at the level at which we were working. It went to the next level and was approved. Finally, at a National Security Council meeting chaired by Vice President George Bush, after some explanation by Mr. Bush of why he wanted to prove, the sale was approved. The key factor here is that the only dissenting vote came from Caspar Weinberger, who I understand will be in this town tomorrow and might be asked questions on the same subject. And that is a key factor which I will explain. The sale was approved at this National Security Council meeting about 2 weeks before the Shultz trip. A day before the Shultz trip, some colleagues of mine who were at the, let's go slightly below the secretary level, at the Commerce Department and at the Defense Department, joined with some of their former colleagues on Capitol Hill, found sympathetic senators, and pointed out a little-known clause from the Export Administration Act, which required that if the president overruled his national security advisor at a National Security Council meeting, the president or the chairman of the National Security Council, as the language of the law reads, was required to give a formal report to Congress. Mr. Reagan and Mr. Bush had not done that. Therefore, when a call came from an unnamed senator to the White House saying, "Where's my formal report on this computer you're giving to China?" a telegram went from the White House to our liaison office in Peking, which caused Mr. Shultz to be awakened sometime after midnight and told not to go forward with the sale of the High-Share 700. Had he happened to have mentioned it at his reception dinner the night before, we don't know how history would have come. Now, the High-Share 700 was a computer used to design the space shuttle, used to design the Pershing missile, and used to design the highest technology missiles in America's arsenal. It is no casual computer. What it is known as a hybrid computer, mixture between an analog and a digital. It allows, almost like an intelligence, as you go forward in each step of the process of analysis of a flight, it allows you to upgrade and integrate the information you've gathered. In more technical language, it performs 50 simultaneous differential equations, updating the answer you get and therefore modifying the information given for the next step of flight analysis. In military terms, it allows the equivalent of skipping about 3 interim prototypes of a missile. So you start with missile A. If you don't have something like a High-Share 700, you'd need to produce maybe 2 years later a missile B, 2 years later a missile C, and then 6 years altogether you'd have the third one in line. By the analysis with the High-Share 700, you go straight to missile D or perhaps even produce missile E. In other words, can skip 10 years in a 2-year time. Therefore, in about 4 or 5 years' time, the Chinese would have the equivalent of a 16 or 20-year move in their technology right up to the level we have. The second computer sale, now this one was not presidentially approved. The stink we made about the high share 700 was enough to cause a little bit of pulling in of the horns, and instead of going knockdown drag out on the ITT 1240, what the administration did was decided to pull together an interagency committee to rewrite our export policies for purposes of sale to China. That was all that was done. I left the administration shortly after that, after being warned by friends that I was becoming a bit too high profile for my own good health, which is when I came to California. The ITT 1240 was packaged in a $1.5 billion sale of telephone digital switching equipment and the production technology to make every aspect of the computers, masks, wafers, etc., for making this ITT 1240 and the relevant hardware. What is significant about this computer is that in 1982-83 timeframe, we did not have in the United States the equivalent production technology of this computer. It was existing in the minds of some and on a benchtop to produce 1 micron technology. For example, in your 8088 microprocessor, which is the center of an IBM personal computer, you have 10 micron technology. The groove in a chip is 10 microns down, 10 microns across, or you might say 100 square microns, which is still pretty small. However, a 1 micron technology takes a groove 1 micron down, 1 micron across, or 1/100th as big. Therefore, we were giving to the People's Republic of China, simultaneous with development in the United States, the ability to miniaturize, say, an IBM personal computer to the size of a pack of camels. This technology would have been passed to the Chinese over about a 5 or 6 year period. In other words, they had to learn to walk before they could run, and run before they could sprint. The 1986-87 was the final transfer of the information for mask making and wafer cutting, or whatever the proper technology is. I am not a Silicon Valley person. This sale was approved because the ITT officials were applying for it through their Belgian subsidiary. Their Belgian subsidiary went to an international organization centered in Paris called COCOM. COCOM approval was then put to the United States, who normally would veto any transfer of technology by a NATO ally to an Eastern Bloc country. In this case, 2 factors were involved. One is we wanted the Belgians to support and allow the Pershing missile to be installed. And second, I have this on, not on written proof, but on verbal reports. There was conversation between a former head of the CIA, who was also the head of a liaison office in Peking, and who is now the Vice President of the United States, suggesting this particular route. As I said, I do not have proof of that. I have that only on speculation. However, taken together, these 2 computers, either one of which gave the Chinese the ability to land an ICBM anywhere in the world. Taken together, the 1 micron technology of the ITT 1240 and the high share 700's ability to process and analyze the trajectory of a missile in order to speed up 4-fold, 2 to 4-fold the design technology of missiles, in truth, would put the Chinese by 1987 ahead of the United States if these 2 sales were approved. They weren't approved. Now, let me ask the question of you and of anyone who listens to this station or your reports in your news. Why would the United States give to the People's Republic of China advanced technology which is right up to date with the highest we could come up with? I have talked to military strategists, East and West Coast, and together we can come only up with one answer. not to get into the arms race and raise even more money because, from arms firms and missile budgets, because this is something that wouldn't even be put through that analysis because it was a sale fostered by the Reagan administration. No, a different answer is the only answer that my colleagues have come up with. Basically, the PRC was being set up to receive a preemptive strike from the Soviet Union. In other words, 2, 3, or 4 years into the progress along the use of the High Share 700, or 2, 3, or 4 years into the establishment of the complete 1-micron computer miniaturization technology of the ITT 1240, either one of those transfers of military technology would have put the Soviets at the risk of receiving an 8 to 10 minute preemptive strike from their neighbors south of the border. It is common knowledge by military analysts that over half of the Soviets' missiles, more than half of the Soviet armed personnel are on the Chinese border. The Soviets' biggest fear is not aggression from us. It's aggression from the Soviet Union. When they deal with the United States, they look for places of weakness in our policies overseas and expand into them out of their basic fear of Western opposition, we'll call it. So therefore, the only answer that we can come up with is that it was done to bait the Soviets, to cause this aggression, which in turn would cause, for example, the Japanese and perhaps even our country to come in alongside the PRC and drag out an activity, a war, formal war activity between these two countries. Now, a question that's been asked to me a number of times, why today? Why this week? Why am I come out now with this rather than a month ago, a year ago, or 3 years ago at the time? My mouth is dry, excuse me. First, I had some hopes back when I ran for Congress in '84, and again as I organized what I thought was a solid grassroots support for my '86 campaign, that I might actually end up in Congress, where I could work with colleagues of common interest with the background I've had working most of my adult life in the administration as an officer, as a Viet Nam veteran, and as someone quite knowledgeable in economic, commercial, military, and strategic affairs of being an effective member of Congress. So one, I've given up on that. I've decided that that is not the approach. But even more significant comes the news to me of the Reagan activities in Libya. And this, again, is something I cannot hand over documents in support. However, colleagues with whom I have spoken have first-hand knowledge of a formal plan under a code name which climaxes in October of this year with a land, sea, and air invasion of Libya. This plan was conceived now over 8 months ago, has been orchestrated in the media, baiting Mr. Gaddafi, proper response in position, next baiting, next response, bringing us along right up to this point of our little summit in Tokyo, and a forecast for now May through October of step by step bringing the American people to the point of wanting us to go into Libya and cripple them. We have been baited, and we are swallowing the bait. That is why I have picked this moment to come forward. I hope colleagues or others who I don't know and have never met, who have more proof on the Libya subject, will follow my example. I am only one person. I have lived one life in my various jobs in government. I came across certain pieces of information which now I can no longer be silent about, which is why I've come forward. I need other one-persons, whether in Washington or have worked with Washington, who have information that can piece together scraps of proof that the American people are being dragged into the war mode. Movies like Rocky IV are just out there making us clamor to be the purest Americans, stomping out evil on the planet. That is not the way of peace. That is the way of world domination, and world domination is not the way of peace. World domination is the way of starting a war between the Soviets and Chinese. What I've decided to do, after dropping my plans for running for Congress and basically dropping a rather high-living lifestyle, is to set up a foundation called the Unity of Heart Foundation. And all those who have information of any sort, whether it be on the Libya issue, the next press conference I will have will be on the subject of the treatment of Vietnam veterans and the atrocities that I've witnessed and others I've talked to have witnessed during their tours in Vietnam. The treatment of Vietnam veterans, some with lawyers, some who don't have lawyers, all of whom have Agent Orange poisoning. Some get $180 a week, welfare. Vietnam veterans who had 2, 3, 5, and 7 lawyers who spent quite a bit of time in court are getting $4,000 a month because of their Agent Orange poisoning. In other words, our government is not treating fairly Vietnam veterans. Now, this is only in regard to the VA end of the Vietnam activity, not in regard to the truth about CIA activities in Vietnam, such as dressing up our Vietnamese allies in Viet Cong and North Vietnamese uniforms, sending them out to perform atrocities on the families of South Vietnamese village chiefs and province chiefs, rapes and murders on fence sitters so they would become U.S. allies. U.S. soldiers and U.S. helicopters airlifted those planes in. I've witnessed it on air bases where under ponchos, Army poncho liners, ponchos on hot days where soldiers, Vietnamese South soldiers, clad in black pajamas with their Russian-issue rifles, carrying their little Vietnamese hats, getting ready to be airlifted off for missions just like this. Soldiers, wherever you are, colleagues from Vietnam, come forward. This Unity of Heart Foundation is going to receive information that you have and help your brothers who are wounded Vietnam veterans. I'm lucky I came back in one piece. Many of my friends did not. That is all I have today. I'm open for any questions you have on any of these subjects. I have not gone to the Justice Department because I have very little faith in our government's ability to check up on itself rather than cover up on itself.
Can you tell how the second computer sale was blocked?
It was at the undersecretary level in a meeting about 50 feet from Mr. Schultz's office on the 7th floor of the State Department. And we frankly kicked up enough dust and mud and described the true nature of the sale, which incidentally was being described as giving the Chinese the digital switching technology they needed to update their telephone systems. America does not have digital switching. We have more mechanical switching here. And interesting, even more interesting, is the amount of digital switching equipment. If they only bought the equipment and not the manufacturing technology to make the equipment they needed to update modern Chinese telephones cost $300 million, not $1.5 billion. $1.5 billion is 1/5 of the annual foreign export earnings of the PRC in the 1982 timetable. 1/5 of their annual export earnings being spent for computer digital switching equipment. Try that on. Incidentally, also, the High Share 700, as I told you, all of which exists in our defense facilities in one form or another, was being sold for purposes of population study and electric motor design. Presumably, they wanted to know to the number of people, how many people they would have in the year 2000 if they needed such a sophisticated computer. I'm jesting on that, obviously.
And what was your job with the Reagan administration again?
My title was Executive Assistant to the Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs.
I have a question. How do we reach a Unity of Heart Foundation?
Post Office Box 5842, Berkeley, California, 94705. We'll have more information on that very soon. I've also asked Christopher Miles, who is the person who introduced this press conference, if he would be the executive director of this, and I will go forward speaking on it around the country to sympathetic audiences, telling this story as widely as I can and encouraging others to come forward similarly.
You're not going to run for Congress again? You're giving that up?
Absolutely. I don't think that progress is going to come from within our system. I think progress is going to come when the people realize their government is out of control.
So you ran in 84 and when?
And in 86, I was preparing to formally run and setting up, excuse me?
For Congress again?
8th Congressional Congress.
How long were you in the position as assistant to the assistant secretary?
I was there only about 9 months. In all, when I was in the Nixon and Ford years, I was in government about 5 years. Executive assistant to the Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs.
Why did you change your mind about running for Congress in 86?
I had set up an organization called the 86 Committee. It was composed of all the volunteer organizations in the 8th Congressional, Republican volunteer organizations in the 8th Congressional, all of which had supported me in 1984. However, in 1984, I ran against a candidate who was supported by a Republican Bay Area organization called the Lincoln Club. The Lincoln Club had decided that the opportunistic thing in 1984 was to recruit a black Republican to run against Ron Dellums. They happened to recruit a fellow who had never lived in Oakland and never worked in the 8th Congressional District, and turned out to be quite a sham, who had changed his name 4 or 5 times, had given phony addresses, and re-registered on his registration card about 4 times. I exposed the fact that he had done all that and was accused of violating the 11th commandment of attacking another Republican. And the Republicans therefore raised a bit of money and slammed me as being disloyal for exposing the fact that this chap was not at all any of the names or any of the descriptions, or nor did he have any of the 6 or 8 Republican congressional endorsements that he had claimed, all of which was proven true, but their mailer was more devastating than my mailer. So in 1986, I set up this committee of all the volunteer organizations, all of which had supported me in 84, and told this organization that I would endorse whoever it selected. What I didn't account for is that the downtown Oakland Republican crowd of Cornell Meyer, Justin Roach, James Dietrich would be able to move the committee upstairs 2 levels, have this committee create 2 subordinate committees, which were individuals who they essentially could hand a name to in nomination, which is what they did. And Stephen Eigenberg, a good, solid young man, I think former mayor of Piedmont, will be the Republican nominee in the 8th Congressional. Since I had told this committee that I would not run against whoever it picked, when they picked Stephen Eigenberg, I said, fine, I'll endorse him.
These former colleagues that were in the State Department, that you have this information?
I did not say that these former colleagues were in the State Department, and I would not use any language whatsoever to identify these colleagues.
But the former colleagues of you?
Well,
I mean, you said that.
yes, they're
Yeah.
former colleagues. That does not necessarily imply they are or are not State Department employees.
Where are they? Who are they?
I would not say anything at all to identify these.
How much is that high share 700?
This is from memory. I believe the high share 700 was 4.5 million, but it might have been something like 7.5. But it was one whale of a lot less than 1.5 billion. We're talking in the millions, roughly $5, $6, $7 million.
And you said it allows for a certain form of artificial intelligence?
My language was that it performs 50 simultaneous differential equations, which allows to continually update the computer algorithm or computer formula put into the computer, so you can update your analysis during a flight. Well, very good. Thank you all very much for coming. The issue today, I wish that some of you might ask Mr. Weinberger tomorrow to to go on with more authority on what he might know of the High Share 700, why he opposed it, why he was told he shouldn't oppose it, and perhaps fill in some of the blanks that you have from someone with a few more gray hairs and a lot more years under his belt. As I said, I'm one person exposed to a couple issues during a few years in government. So I'm glad you all came and glad to have this opportunity to share this with whoever you can pass the information on to. Thank you very much. You okay?